Okay. Well, thank you, Aitan Goelman, for joining us here for the first episode of Objections, a Law and Crime podcast. As I mentioned to you earlier, one of the reasons that I wanted to reach out, of course, is because of what we saw with the U.S. Capitol riots and your experience. I knew you would have some great expertise on this, not only as a former prosecutor in the Oklahoma City bombing case, but one of the men that you work with on that case, who's Judge Merrick Garland, who may soon be the Attorney General of the United States, who will inherit a lot of these cases. And I want to get your insights about what went through your mind, first of all, on January 6th, when all of this was going on, and how you could draw from your experience to make sense of what happened. So I think I'll just start things off very broadly with that question. When the Capitol insurrection was happening, did it remind you of 1995?
What went through my mind while I was watching was probably what went through pretty much everybody's mind, which is, how the hell aren't the police more prepared, and how are they, so hopelessly outnumbered, and allowing people to overrun the center of American democracy. But I was not surprised. I mean, I was surprised by that particular act, but I was not surprised by violence kind of coming out of the far right in the wake of an election that the president of the United States has been telling everybody falsely has been stolen from him. And, I actually do think that there are some analogies back to the, early to mid 90s before the Oklahoma City bombing in terms of what the conspiracy theories that at that point were circulating among extremists at gun shows and in militia training ground, and what is circulating online. I think that one of the big differences is it's much more dangerous now because, for years you've had this conspiracy mongering being tweeted from the Oval Office or retweeted, and it, reaches a order of magnitude greater audience than the 1993 and 94, all the kind of agitation about Waco and the New World Order and the Clinton healthcare plan, and they're coming to take away your guns in the wake of the 1994 assault ban rifle. Here, there's millions or tens of millions of people that believe that the Democrats are a bunch of cannibalistic child molesters, and Trump is sent by God to to save everybody. And that's, if you tell people that enough times, eventually some people are going to take that seriously, and you can understand why they'd be spurred to direct action or violence.
Mm. And I want to zoom in on that, the conspiracy that incited the 1990 the Oklahoma City bombing back in 1995. There, back then we were talking about people playing and replaying DVDs all the time, right? I mean, how
Right.
was that
or
kind of
or or VHS even at the time, I think.
right? So you're saying it's orders of magnitude now, when much more widespread, when you have the president of the United States propagating these theories, retweeting these theories with social media. How do you combat that? When uh, President Joe Biden steps into office, uh, there is going to be a large number of people in the United States who have been exposed and indoctrinated in these things. How do you counteract that disinformation?
I don't have an easy answer, unfortunately. I think that the idea of the First Amendment has always been there's a marketplace of ideas, and you let everybody say whatever they want. In the end, the good ideas win out over the bad because people are ultimately able to discern the truth from lies. I don't have a lot of confidence in that anymore. I mean, you look at just the way that a lot of people are siloed and get their uh, news from their kind of social media feed, and the way that the media market is splintered. So in 1994, 95, there was Fox News and CNN, and the networks, but there weren't all these hundreds or thousands of different kind of splinter channels and different ways of that people are fed information. And a good portion of that is not information at all, it's misinformation. And you've got people who really, I don't think, know what to believe anymore. And it seems like, I mean, some of the things that people honestly believe, like, just to take one of the most prominent examples, the QAnon conspiracy, it sounds ludicrous. I mean, you listen to it and you say, how can anyone in their right mind even entertain that this is a real possibility?
Mm.
But there are people who believe it, and not just a small number of people. And you look back to Pizzagate, right in the beginning of the Trump administration, where somebody who believed in that Hillary Clinton was trafficking child sex victims went in and shot up a pizza place in D.C. just because someone online had said that's where the center of the conspiracy is.
Right.
It is. I don't know how you stop the kind of conflagration of lies, especially when you also have their adversarial outside powers who are interested in Americans being at each other's throats, and Americans not knowing what the actual truth is, and who actually propagate that. I mean, a lot of this is domestic, but I also think there's intelligence services of Russia and other countries that are kind of deliberately fanning the flames of this.
Mm. So there's two parts of that. How do you counteract this messaging that's inciting this sort of violence and these riots? But also, how do you prosecute that? Because we're starting to see. I believe the U.S. Attorney from the District of Columbia has talked about setting up a sedition quote strike force that's going to be analyzing a lot of these cases. Uh, and as you know better than anyone, the terrorism department of the Department of Justice looks a lot different from the time that you were prosecuting the Oklahoma City bombing case to what it looks like today. How do you anticipate it will evolve, and what do you think should happen?
Well, and I think one question is, how do you prosecute this, and whether or not you need new legislation, or whether or not the laws that are on the books are enough. And I think another question is how you detect this, and how you find out the people who are planning to commit violent acts, and how you hopefully stop it ahead of time. I mean, the Capitol insurrection, I think, is somewhat of a special case, because you have thousands of videos that are circulating on social media that show the people who are in there, and a lot of them were posted by those people themselves. So you have these people being identified. The act has already been committed. They're being arrested, some for relatively minor crimes. Some will see superseding indictments and charged with more serious crimes. But I think a more important question is, how do you try to find the next, Tim McVeigh before he actually detonates the truck bomb in front of a federal building? And, if you look at the post 9/11 kind of toolbox that law enforcement has used, and it hasn't been perfect. You had the USA Patriot Act passed, and you have, kind of criticism of that from civil libertarians. And you also have criticism that it wasn't enough and didn't allow the government to do enough. But by and large, law enforcement has kept Americans safe from Islamic terrorism since 9/11. There have been some incidences and some people have died, but there hasn't been. I mean, I don't know if you remember the days after 9/11. Everybody was bracing for the next mega attack. Everyone was sure it was going to happen. It was just a question of when. And that hasn't happened. And I think that the FBI and other law enforcement partners actually deserve a lot of credit for that. And you saw them using, I mean, 1994, people were being radicalized at gun shows and in militias. Since 9/11, more and more people are being self-radicalized and radicalized from the outside online. And so you have jihadi chat rooms that the FBI would infiltrate, that they would, pose as a fellow traveler, pose as another jihadi, pose as another Islamic extremist. And sometimes, they would get introduced to somebody online. They'd meet somebody online who was ready to take direct action and ready to attack the United States. And you saw, I mean, there's at least a dozen or so plots that were disrupted. Some of them were disrupted early, and then the FBI started getting criticism. Well, they weren't really going to do anything. The defendants here, there was just a lot of talk. So the FBI kind of um, refined their tactics, and you saw a number of attacks where there was an FBI informant posing as a jihadi who, at the last minute, substituted inert explosives for the real thing. And sometimes they had videos of the would-be terrorist actually pressing a button that they thought was going to blow up a bomb, that they thought was going to blow up a building and kill people. And I think that the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, they need to use the toolkit that they've used against Islamic extremists also against domestic extremists, because the vast majority of this kind of talk and planning is happening online.
So that kind of raises another question. Do you believe that there needs to be a domestic terrorism statute, that there is not one currently? What should Congress get to work on creating one? And if so, how do folks in Congress craft that so it doesn't raise some of the criticism that we saw during the war against terrorism about so-called predictive policing, that this notion that we're going to anticipate threats before they happen has been criticized by many civil libertarians. So I guess it's a two-part question. Should a domestic terrorism statute exist, and how can it uh, safeguard that balance?
Well, you're right, there's no standalone domestic terrorism statute right now. There is the definition of domestic terrorism in the federal code, but there's no kind of standalone crime. If you do this, you're committing an act of domestic terrorism. Would it be easier for the FBI or to the Department of Justice to prosecute some of those cases if there was that standalone statute? Sure. Is it likely that there are going to be these acts of domestic extremism that can't be prosecuted under current laws? Probably not.
Hmm.
You have a number of different, I mean, depending on what the target is, depending on what the conspiracy is, depending on whether or not there's a weapon of mass destruction like a big bomb that's being used. There are a bunch of different statutes that you can already use. It's always nice to have another tool in your toolkit if you're a prosecutor, but I'm not sure that that is kind of the most important question right now. I think you kind of touched on one of the issues here. I mean, you're right, there was a lot of criticism of the government for, and not just the FBI, also the NYPD, where they had that program where they were recruiting informants in New York mosques. And there was a uproar that, oh, you're targeting American Muslim community, and there's a lot of criticism of that. And obviously you have a right under the First Amendment to practice your religion freely, right? You have free exercise. You also have a right under the First Amendment to express your opinion freely. And so you don't want to chill either of those activities by trying to detect violent actors before they act. But I still think that is a line that you can stay on the one side, and you can continue to allow people to freely exercise their religion or freely express their opinion, but still be watching online as these plots germinate. I mean, you do have a right to exercise your religion or or make your opinion clear. You don't have a right to conspire with other people to kill people or to blow up federal buildings, right? That's where the federal law against conspiracy comes in.
Mm.
And I don't have all that much sympathy for someone who is online in a QAnon chat room and arranges to meet someone else so that they can hang Mike Pence or blow up a federal building, and then they turn around and say, I was just exercising my right to express myself. Or the same thing with Islamic extremists. I was just practicing my religion. There is a limit that the First Amendment allows you to do those things. It doesn't allow you to kill other people.
Right. And so you think that in terms of where this gets to the dangerous zone, where people are actively plotting, prosecutors already have those tools under existing law, that if Merrick Garland is confirmed his first day on the job, he can look at the cases and he has everything he needs under his toolkit to prosecute these cases?
I think so. I mean, I think that again, you can always make it easier for the government. You can give them new tools. You can make it more elegant for them to bring. I mean, you can say, well, why should there be an international terrorism standalone crime, but not a domestic terrorism? I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. But I don't think that the most important thing is new legislation. I think it is government focus on the threat of right wing extremism. And you notice that when the FBI said something in 2019 about the danger of white supremacist terrorism and far right extremism, the Trump administration basically muzzled that. And,
Right.
So the Bureau knows that this is out there. And, I'm hopeful that Chris Wray, even under the Trump administration, was, trying to take steps to address this. And I think with, if hopefully Merrick Garland will be confirmed, and there will be a renewed sense of seriousness in addressing this threat before something happens where a lot more people get killed.
Right. And you mentioned that there's no domestic terrorism statute. Do you think that the language of domestic terrorism, that even just describing some of the alleged acts that we saw at the Capitol, whether it's planting pipe bombs outside of DNC and RNC headquarters, should the government be more aggressive in describing this as a domestic terrorist plot?
I mean, that's what it is. I don't think you can fairly quibble with that. If you are trying to plant a pipe bomb, because you consider your political people who disagree with you politically to be your blood enemies, you are, trying to. I don't know that I forget the exact definition of domestic terrorism, but it's something trying to coerce a population or a government through, violent means. That I don't think we should be shy about, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, acts like a duck. It's a duck. I don't know why anyone would deny that that's domestic terrorism. And I'm not just talking about right wing domestic terrorism. I think the Bernie Sanders supporter who shot Steve Scalise and a bunch of other Congress people at a softball practice. That's domestic terrorism too.
Right.
We need to kind of get away from people trying to provide some kind of cover or justification from their side, and treat violent acts designed to go after people who disagree with you politically all the same. And
Right.
and that really is one thing. We talked earlier about, well, how do you how do you convince people, the tens of millions of people who voted for Trump and think that the election was stolen? How do you convince them to trust institutions again? How do you convince them that there isn't this wide conspiracy? And I really think that the first step in that is to have political leaders who are not nut jobs to really try to call out their own side. So there are people, Republican members of Congress now, who are supporters of QAnon.
Right.
I think that the Republican caucus, the Republican leadership should, disown them.
Right. And
I,
not to put too fine a point on it, more than half of the House GOP supported a effort to call into question the results of the 2020 election, which itself is a conspiracy theory that in part was responsible for what we saw on January 6th. So, how do you maneuver with that when more than half of the members of a party in a branch of the government were all in up until January 6th and through January 6th, committed to that conspiracy theory? How do you alter that environment? Is part of it just private companies taking action, just like Twitter did, and other social media organizations, at Amazon kicking Parler off their server? Uh, what? How does the government respond to other branches of government being a wellspring of misinformation and dangerous misinformation?
mean, it is really a difficult question to answer. I mean, there are still, principled conservatives in this country, or people who are Republican but believe in the rule of law and don't subscribe to just these fantastical imaginary lies that Trump has peddled. They have not been the dominant force in the Republican Party in Congress the last couple of years. So I think that there needs to be some kind of reckoning within the Republican Party to decide, is this really who we are? Are we really 120 of our members who voted to essentially challenge the results of a legitimate election by pretending that they were concerned about widespread fraud? And I think a lot of them, the overwhelming majority of them, probably personally don't believe in any of this, but are worried about a primary challenge and worried about the kind of Republican base being weaponized against them politically. Right. I think people have to kind of look at themselves and decide, is that worth it? Are you going to kind of kowtow to the to the crazies in your party because you're scared of soon to be former President Trump tweeting something mean about you? And I don't know how that internal struggle within the Republican Party turns out, but I think it has to happen.
We've been following a lot of these post-election cases for Law&Crime, and one of the early ones that struck me, and I thought I'd run it by you, was a case of a man charged with threatening public officials, and quite clearly Senate Minority Leader, soon to be Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. And he was echoing Trump's conspiracy theories about the election and said the election was stolen from us, now cartridge box. But there was another thing that he said, which would probably resonate for your experience prosecuting the Oklahoma City bombing case. He said the Turner Diaries need to become real. And he threatened blowing up government buildings. To what extent is there a direct line between the Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh and what we saw on January 6th?
I think it definitely springs from the same milieu and the same kind of thinking. I mean, the Turner Diaries itself has been a really influential book among the extreme right and among neo-Nazis. And McVeigh personally used the bombing of the FBI building in the Turner Diaries using a ammonium nitrate and fuel oil bomb, truck bomb, as kind of a blueprint for the bomb that he built to use to destroy the Murrah building and kill 168 people. That book has been, extremely influential and extremely damaging. McVeigh had copies of excerpts from the Turner Diaries with him when he was arrested, driving away from Oklahoma City about an hour after the bombing. And, it starts with the value of our attacks today. That was the excerpt that McVeigh had in his car. The value of our attacks today is to show these, cowardly federal officials that they're not safe anywhere and will make people get off the fence. So I know that McVeigh did not intend the Oklahoma City bombing to be a one-off. He didn't think that that'd be, an event, kill a lot of people, and then, be kind of widely repudiated and not cause a huge conflagration of violence in the U.S. He thought that was going to be the first shot in the Second American Revolution, and that the government would respond to it by, cracking down and violating people's civil liberties, and that in turn would radicalize more people on the right, and then there'd be more violence and more crackdown, and you'd have a spiral of attack and counterattack until you had basically the civil war that is described in the Turner Diaries. So I think that is still the mindset of people on the extreme right, that this is kind of, we need something to motivate people to get off the fence. There are a lot of people who talk about conservative principles, right-wing principles, but we want real actors. We want them to be forced to choose between being part of the system and being part of the next American Revolution. So there's absolutely a straight philosophical line between McVeigh and Nichols in 1995 and some of the people in the Capitol building. And also, you can't really get away from the racism, the white supremacists, and McVeigh, who for a time was actually a member of the KKK and was absolutely a racist. I don't think his primary motivation was hatred of minorities. I think his primary motivation was hatred of the government. But there's a lot of overlap there. There's a lot of overlap between Christian identity and the people who believe in the replacement theory, which is right. Jews come and bring a lot of minorities into the country in order to replace white Christians. There's a lot of overlap between those people and the 3%ers and the oath keepers, and it's all kind of a a toxic brew of racists, neo-Nazis, and people who are just more pure anti-government types.
Mm. If we were talking in the kind of post 9/11 context, we might refer to certain material support cases. If we're looking at this in a terrorism rubric, there have been groups that have funded some of the buses that came forward. Not to say, obviously, this refers to foreign terrorist organizations and it might not apply to this case, but how do prosecutors or how do even regulators get at dangerous activities by the groups and people who organized things if they knew that there was going to be a storming of the Capitol, if that was being openly advertised and that was and they knew that there was going to be a storming and they precipitated that. How do prosecutors get at the companies and the people behind them involved?
Well, what you're positing that and you can prove that somebody chartered a bus to go to Washington in order to bring people there to storm the Capitol, that's conspiracy. You could get those people there. The problem is the proof, right? Because you have people say, well, I didn't think that they were going to go and storm the Capitol. I didn't think that they were going to, beat a police officer to death with an American flagpole. I just thought that they were there to, peacefully exercise their First Amendment rights. And I think that whether or not you have a material support statute, I mean, that could allow you to, as the government, to designate terrorism organizations, domestic terrorism organizations, the same way the government does foreign terror organizations. And that's how, you can prosecute people for providing material support to ISIS or Hamas or something like that. I guess you could try to kind of graft that onto the domestic equivalent, but there's still a lot of people who would fall through the cracks there because really they're not legally responsible, at least provably legally responsible for the violence, right?
Right.
I mean, take the Alex Joneses of the world, or they can fan the flames, they can spread lies that convince people that their country is being stolen, and that they just need to take action directly. But unless you prove that they intentionally supported and contributed to a particular crime or particular violent act, they may not have criminal legal liability for that. But there's a big difference between legal liability and moral responsibility. I mean, you've heard a lot about, oh, we're going to, Trump probably can be prosecuted for inciting the riot. Maybe. I think it'd be tough. I think you run into some real First Amendment problems there. But I don't think there's any question that Trump is morally responsible for, lighting the match and giving the kerosene to a pyromaniac. I mean, the same way that when the NRA president in I think 1994 and 1995 sent a letter telling American patriots that the next time they see a black booted federal thug come onto their property, they should shoot him.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was Wayne LaPierre. Was he legally responsible for Oklahoma City? No. Does he bear some moral culpability? I think absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think you're going to be able to solve all of this just through enforcement or legal means.
Right. And in one of the most chilling scenes we saw in the Capitol was the erecting of the gallows. I mean, there were so many chilling scenes, but that was one of them. And the crowd chanting "Hang Mike Pence." Uh, do you think that was a reference to what white supremacists and neo Nazis call the Day of the Rope? Given the amount of far right iconography and the participation of white supremacist groups in this event?
I mean, I know that there's a chapter in the Turner Diaries called "The Day of the Rope,"
Right.
where
That's why I'm asking.
yeah, where they hang race traitors, right? They like hang white women who slept with black men, and they, take revenge on their enemies, and it's kind of a, I think, historical shout out to Kristallnacht in,
Hmm.
Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if the, people who actually erected those gallows, were adherents of Turner Diaries, but I don't see how you see a gallows with a noose there and a crowd chanting "Hang Mike Pence," and whether it's a reference to that particular chapter of the Turner Diaries, it is absolutely a call to violence, right? I mean,
Right.
who erects a gallows at a peaceful political protest?
Right.
Who brings in zip ties to the home of a democratically elected legislature? What exactly do you think you're going to be doing with those?
Right. And one person was seen holding a stun gun and sitting in a chair in Nancy Pelosi's office. Uh, it's a what do you do with those? Did the United States get lucky? Could it have been much worse based on everything that you've seen? Given the presence of people carrying these weapons onto the Capitol.
No question at all. I mean, yeah, just engage in a thought experiment, right? That the Capitol Police hadn't gotten, Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence and Chuck Schumer to a safe place. And what exactly was that mob going to do when they came across Nancy Pelosi? Were they going to reason with her? Were they going to engage in, spirited political debate about the outcome of the election? I would not want to take that chance.
Mm.
I definitely
And
think there were people in that crowd who were prepared to, murder public officials. Now, would they have carried the day? Would they have actually done that? Would they have been able to do that? I don't know, but I mean, I think it's incredibly irresponsible to be Pollyanna-ish and say, no, they were just trying to blow off steam.
right, right. And in terms of uh, again going back to uh, your experience in Oklahoma City and working together with Merrick Garland, how do you think that, assuming that he is confirmed as our next Attorney General, how does the experience of having prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombing cases shape his handling of these cases and shape uh, what lessons does he bring from that experience into the evolution of white supremacist domestic terrorism?
There's no question that anybody who was part of the Oklahoma bombing task force was that was a formative experience, and I think that Merrick will take the threat of extremism and militant violence seriously, even if it's not from a foreign source. So I think he will absolutely be more sensitized to that than maybe somebody who was not steeped in the. And I think Merrick was also around during Waco, and I, I I I think that has informed his worldview because it has to. But I think that the reason that Judge Garland is such an inspired choice isn't directly connected to the fact that he was, kind of the overseer of the Oklahoma bombing prosecution team. I think that he is an inspired choice because he's really the attorney general that the department and the country needs right now on a broader level. I mean, he's very much of a lawyer's lawyer, very much of a follow the facts and apply the law where they are. I mean, he's the least political DC Circuit Judge that you can find, and it's got respect from people on both sides of the aisle because of that. So I think that he really, I assume he'll get confirmed easily, and I think that if I were a prosecutor in the Department of Justice today, I would be so kind of relieved and thrilled, that someone like him is going to be at the helm after the last 4 years of really unprecedented politicization of the department. Um, he's exactly the person that Biden should have nominated. I thought that was, one of the most hopeful signs, in addition to Trump losing the election, that I've seen in this country in a long time.
And in terms of how the Oklahoma City bombing case shaped you, how do you, in terms of what lessons, how did it shape your career? Number one. Number two, how do you think, let me just kind of rephrase that question. So in terms of the Oklahoma City bombings case, how did that affect your career as a lawyer? How do you think the threat of domestic terrorism, and in particular white supremacist domestic terrorism, should have been taken more seriously over the ensuing decades? What would you have liked to have seen happen in the federal government, and what would you like to continue to see happen in the federal government?
Okay, well, that's about 8 questions.
I
Let
know.
me
I should.
let me talk about like my personal kind of involvement in the way it affected me first, and then kind of turn to the broader question. Um, for me, it really was a formative experience. I mean, I was 27 years old when I got sent out to Oklahoma City after the bombing, and I worked on that case and that case alone for 3 years, and the people, both some of the FBI agents on the task force, and the families of the victims and some of the survivors, and the other, members of the prosecution team, had an enormous impact on, like, my kind of formation of my character. I mean, I really think that the people who were like the lead prosecutors on the prosecution team, Joe Hartzler and Larry Mackey, were such kind of by the book good government guys that they really became role models to me. And that was one the first big case in my career, and I felt and still feel incredibly privileged to have been able to play a part in that. And back then, that was right after the O.J. Simpson acquittal, and I think that the American criminal justice system was really kind of in somewhat disrepute. And I thought that the way that that case was prosecuted and tried, where the defendants were afforded every every opportunity to contest the case, and the justice system really worked there. I thought it was really inspiring, and for me personally, I just am grateful that I was able to be part of something worth doing. That even though no matter what I do for the rest of my career, I kind of always have that. Now, having said that, it is weird to do that when you're 27, and then kind of what's your next act. So I have absolutely cared about all the other cases I've done since then, but it is hard when you really feel like you're I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I almost felt during that case that, like, that's the reason that I was put on the planet, to do that. I really felt kind of inspired there. So that's for me personally. In terms of the kind of the broader question, I mean, one thing that I came away with really is the power of rhetoric and conspiracy theories and lies if they go unanswered. Because back then, among the militia movement, among the patriot movement, there were all kinds of conspiracy theories swirling, right? There was the siege at Waco, and then the fire that tragically killed 70 some people, which was a horrible misstep by the government. But there was a VHS video circulating at the time. I think it's called 51 Days at Waco, which was used edited footage to prove that the government actually intentionally murdered the Branch Davidians at Waco. And then there was the Ruby Ridge siege of Randy Weaver, which was also a screw up by the government, but was also used to suggest that the government was coming for your guns. Or you had the Clinton assault gun ban, which was used to convince people that there was this UN plot called the New World Order, and there would be UN tanks in their front yard the next day. Or that the Clinton healthcare plan, which never passed, was the pretext for giving away of American sovereignty. And all those things were lies, and some of them were just easily provable lies. The Clinton healthcare plan there didn't even pass, right? So you think, well, if I'm fed that lie and then I see that it doesn't happen, maybe I'll start questioning the source. But people who are kind of in those subcultures don't do that. The lie just kind of shifts a little bit. Okay, it wasn't the healthcare plan. It really is next year that the New World Order is going to come and take over, right? So my concern with the current swirl of lies and the lies from the last 3 or 4 years, the deep state, right? You have this unelected band of elites who are trying to thwart the people, or the election was stolen, or the Jews are trying to replace white Christians with minorities. All this stuff, none of it has a scintilla of truth, but you have people who ought to know better, who, even if they're not directly espousing that, they're allowing that kind of stuff to fester. And just diving into the subculture of the militias and the far right, I can't tell you how many books and pamphlets and gun show nuts I interviewed and read back then. You really this stuff takes on a life of its own. And if it is not, if people act irresponsibly and they think, well, it's not going to hurt me, so I can kind of indulge those fantasies even if I don't personally believe them, that's a huge mistake, because that stuff grows and it becomes harder and harder, to put out that fire. And I think we're going to see the results of that, in the next several years. I am convinced that, the Capitol insurrection is far from, the last act of violence that we're going to see from people who believe those lies.
Right. And just
And you can understand it, right? You can understand if you really believe that you're about to live under tyranny. You really believe the election was stolen. You really believe that you're about to be replaced. You really believe that unless you fight for it, your country's going to be gone. You believe that, there's a way to say, well, maybe they are justified in what they're doing. The problem is that they believe in lies.
Right. Right. And you mentioned earlier, Timothy McVeigh believed that the horrific bombing, the killing of children and government workers by 168 people, he thought that would inspire people to do things like him. Do you think that the breach of the Capitol is inspiring these groups the same way, or do you believe that's their hope that it will have that effect?
Well, you already have, what's her name, that woman Babbitt, who is being called the first martyr of the Second American Revolution. Right. So I do think that stuff's going to be used for, propaganda purposes by people on the far right. But, let's look at what happened after Oklahoma City and what didn't happen, right? McVeigh was wrong about the reaction, even from some of his fellow travelers on the right, right? And people were just repulsed. There was a daycare center in the building and 19 babies were murdered. So that, I think, in some ways, even people who were kind of traveling down that path looked at it and were repelled. and distanced themselves from it. And so, it didn't become the first shot in the new American Revolution. It stands out as, a senseless, isolated, and incredibly destructive act. And I think that, at least in the immediate aftermath of the Capitol insurrection, you started to see a lot of people, even people who had been, willing to indulge Trump's lies, start thinking, whoa, this is a little bit too far. This is where it's going to bleed. I mean, you definitely saw, Mitch McConnell do that, right?
Right.
The fact that, I was disappointed that instead of, 5 out of the 10 senators who were going to raise objections to the certification, I think it should have been 0. I think that all 120 members of the House should have, refused to sign on to that. But, you do see, for the first time, some sane members of the Republican Party starting to put distance between, themselves and the nut jobs in their own ranks.
Right. And do you keep in touch with some of the families of the victims of the attacks?
I do. We each put some victims on the stand and family members on the stand. So I still stay in touch with some of them. It's funny. I was in New York. I was a assistant U.S. attorney in Manhattan on 9/11, and after the terrorist attacks there was this center that was set up on the kind of Upper West Side for family members to come and get like services and look and whatever kind of government help was available to them. And there were volunteers from the U.S. Attorney's Office who staffed that center. I did it a couple times, and one of the people there who was helping in that effort was a survivor or the wife of one of the Secret Service agents who was killed in Oklahoma City, and there that kind of victim community was trying to help out in New York. So that the bombing and the trials afterwards, really kind of galvanized the survivor community in Oklahoma City, and to the point where they got a couple acts of Congress passed during the trial when the judge said that if you were going to testify at the penalty phase, you weren't allowed to be in the trial, or we're not going to have closed circuit television to allow people in Oklahoma City to watch what's going on in Denver. They went to Congress, and Congress passed laws basically overturning that judge's decision. So they really kind of came together as a community, and they still have the memorials every year. I mean, when did I go down last? I think it was it the 25th was last year, and I didn't go. I think it was the 20th was the last time I went down to the 20th anniversary of the bombing. And actually, Judge Garland was there, and so were several other members of the prosecution team.
Mm. That was 5 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
Little more.
Yeah, it's 2015. Right.
Right. And right now, you're an attorney with Zuckerman Spader. One of your clients is Peter Strzok. Obviously, there have been uh, there. President Trump has tried to vilify your client in an effort to spin conspiracy theories about the Russia investigation. Is this just an extension of this kind of conspiratorial thinking that we've been seeing for the past 4 years?
Yeah. No, I think that. I mean, yeah, President Trump cannot open his mouth without telling a lie. And that, was, I think, pretty apparent in 2016. And, I think that has kind of continued unabated. And, I mean, among the terrible effects that he's had is, convincing a good chunk of the American people that, public servants are the enemy. The media is the enemy. There's a deep state. And, the Russia investigation was a hoax and a witch hunt. And, you just keep repeating that over and over and over again. And, eventually some people are going to believe it. And so you have, and not just Pete, but, Ambassador Vindman and Fiona Hill and a bunch of other people who are, just trying to do their jobs, and they are, demonized and attacked by the president, who, basically unleashes, his most rabid supporters on them. Um, we should be encouraging people to do government service. We should be grateful to people who you know make much less money and work really long hours to provide good government to people. Government's not the enemy of the American people. So I think that is yet another really toxic result of 4 years of Donald Trump as president.
And so after long
I mean, this is a guy who at a rally mimicked Pete and Lisa Page having sex and having mimicked an orgasm.
Right.
That's the president of the United States. I mean, that's like the final kind of desecration of an office that was once held by like Lincoln and Washington. I mean, it's you wouldn't believe it if I told you that 5 years ago, that the president of the United States was going to do that.
Right. And how is your client doing today, Pete?
He's okay. I mean, he was, fired from the FBI in an act that we allege was a violation of his constitutional rights because it constituted viewpoint discrimination, right? Anybody who said something nasty about Hillary or something nice about Trump, they could do that without any fear of, retaliation, even if it violated the Hatch Act. But, God forbid you criticize the Mad King, you lose your job. So we have a lawsuit going on there on behalf of Pete. And, he wrote a book, but he still doesn't have a regular job. He's become so notorious because of, the presidential tweet storms that it's not easy to kind of, resume your life.
Mm. And obviously you've been in private practice for a while. Before that, you had a long career with the Department of Justice. If Merrick Garland is confirmed and wanted to bring you back on board with the DOJ to tackle the Capitol insurrection cases, might the band get back together?
I don't know if the band would get back together, but I think I would always take a call from Judge Garland. I don't expect that to happen, but I certainly would entertain that. I also, just to the interest of full disclosure, I was a political appointee in the second Obama administration. I was enforcement director at the CFTC, so I've been kind of in and out of government since. But yeah, I was a federal prosecutor for the first 9 years of my career.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I always like to ask at the end of interviews a question that I always tend to end with. Is there anything that I haven't asked you during our conversation that you'd like to talk about?
I have heard that question before, not just in interviews, but also in like when, the Department of Justice is interviewing someone or you're doing background interviews. And I've always hated that question because I can never think of anything at the time. So the answer is no. I guess the only thing I wanted to say, because even though I'm, a Democrat and I was a Obama political appointee, I actually don't think, the Democrats have all the answers and the Republicans are necessarily the enemy. I am worried about political polarization, in this country, and I think that Trump has made things immeasurably worse, and that the right wing has been the primary malefactors. But I also think that the left deserves a measure of blame for this too. I mean, I thought George W. Bush was, not a great president in some ways and made some mistakes, but I don't think he was a murderer. I don't think 9/11 was an inside job. And, when you have like a dishonest filmmaker like Michael Moore, who says that in Fahrenheit 9/11 and then is embraced by the Democratic Party, I think that, that the Democrats deserve some measure of blame too for the degradation of public discourse.
Mm.
On
And
the other hand, you never had a Democratic president, tweeting lies from the Oval Office.
right.
So I don't ascribe to whataboutism, and I don't think the scales are anywhere near equal. But I do think that we'd be a better country and have a healthier body politic if we stopped kind of posturing and making people who we disagree with be, mortal enemies and horrible people, because that's often not the case.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Aitan. I appreciate you coming on to the show, and I'll let you know when the podcast is up.